Yeah, so therefore, a warm welcome from my side to the IOER Forum. My name is Mark Wolfram. I'm the director of the Leibniz-Institut of Ecological, Urban and Regional Development, and I'm very happy to welcome our guest speaker today, Markus Grillitsch from Lund University. And there will be an accompanying presentation also from a IOER colleague, Jonathan Morris, and both of them are already with us, so very warm welcome. The topic today will be regional growth and regional development, and the challenge that this implies, of course, for sustainability transformation. Therefore, a highly topical subject, and I think both have worked extensively on these issues, and I would like to first of all, of course, introduce our speaker for that matter. Markus Grillitsch is certainly known to many of you, one of the key researchers in the field of regional development and regional economic development, and in particular regarding the role and different forms of agency in this regard. So Markus is currently the director of CIRCLE, which is the Center for Innovation Research at Lund University. He's also a senior lecturer there at the Department of Human Geography, but he's also associate professor at Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences. He received his PhD in economics and business administration from Vienna University and did his habilitation in economic geography already at Lund University. So as you probably know, his research deals with and engages with regional development, innovation questions, innovation policy, of course. And he has published widely, of course, in leading journals in this regard. One of your key co-authors, I think, Markus Grillitsch from Tampere University was also another presenter 2 years ago here in the forum. And yeah, you also regularly work with public agencies, international organizations with a view to develop actionable knowledge and policy guidance. So welcome, Markus Grillitsch. Very nice to have you here. And we are, of course, very curious about what you would like to say today. The word is yours.
Thank you, Mark, for these very nice words. It's my pleasure to be here with you, and an honor also. I have to say that I have a bit of a cough, some kind of corona aftermath. So I hope you can excuse this. But let's go right into the presentation. Let me try to share my screen. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, that works.
Yes, very good. So my talk today is about a topic that I have discussed intensively, of course, with different of my colleagues, and particularly Lars Kuhnen and Kevin Morgan. So we had a presentation on that topic at the Global Conference for Economic Geography 2 weeks ago, and parts of this presentation is also built on that work. And the topic is from growth-oriented to sustainable regional development. And when I started to work with this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lot of concern about innovation, regional policy, promoting growth, not addressing all regions equally. There was a concern about regions left behind, like in the issue of The Economist from 2017, I think it was, discussing regions that were left behind, those that were hurt by globalization, those that would then vote primarily for Trump, for instance, and basically indicating that this disparities between regions create all kinds of social and political tensions that also need to be addressed. There was another report of the World Bank Group on Growing United. There they suggested that Europe's convergence machine was kind of on hold. This was after the financial crisis. Until then, they argued that Europe was one of the few larger regions or continents, however you want to call it, that actually achieved the convergence between regions, but then that after the financial crisis, it went the other direction. And in this report, there was a similar analysis as in The Economist, and also the report on the right-hand side. Basically, the knowledge economy creates certain winners. The winners are largely the large urban areas, the metropolitan areas, while the other regions are left behind, where you have less knowledge density, less innovation, and thus less growth. And this was then also of concern for Simona Iammarino, Andres Rodriguez Pose, and Michael Storper in this working paper for the GRC, why regional development matters for Europe's economic future. And there they also draw this distinction between efficiency of regional development and the equity. So they would argue that in the knowledge economy, most innovation happens in the big cities. It would be most efficient to also invest the most resources in these metropolitan areas. But then this, of course, would even make the disparities greater. And so there needs to be also the concern of equity. So investing in regions that are maybe less productive than the large metropolitan areas in order to address social or political tensions. And that for Europe, for the cohesion of the European regions, the European Union, it is necessary to balance efficiency and equity. And this was really the rationale of the big urban areas, having the highest knowledge density, most innovation, and thus most growth. A growth-oriented regional policy, largely resting on innovation and the knowledge economy. But then, of course, in the last few years, other agendas dominated increasingly the policy debate, and of course also what we have been researching on, and these are the societal challenges. Of course, we know for a long time that the Earth is warming up quickly, but it has, I would say, arrived in our regional policy domain the last maybe five to 10 years more explicitly. So that regional development policy, innovation policy should not only address economic growth, but should also address societal challenges such as, in particular, climate warming. Usually it's also mentioned that it also should address the kind of double crisis of climate change, as well as the growing inequalities between regions. And then, of course, you are all aware of COVID. I'm just have been victim of it myself. But that also this, of course, required a lot of change from different types of regions. So what was quite interesting here is actually with COVID and also the climate change debate, and that actually gave even more, I would say, relevance to our work on agency, is that if you look at the different countries in Europe, different regions, that they have faced a similar kind of challenge. But how they actually addressed this challenge was differed greatly between regions, between nations, and also the outcome was then highly different. So in a way that agency, that what actually regional policy actors do matters for the outcome. So I think that was a quite important finding as well. So this is kind of the overall background here, that regional development policy, regional innovation policy should now not only address economic growth and competitiveness, but should also address societal challenges. And therefore, the idea that regional development should contribute to sustainable development. Regional development policy should contribute to sustainable development. And in this context, there are many attempts or policy experiments, I would call them, to create a regional development policy that addresses societal challenges. And I'm sure many of you are aware of these attempts and processes. Both the ones that I'm talking here about is, on the one hand, smart specialization for sustainable development goals, and the other one to the right hand, the partnerships for regional innovation. Both of them built on smart specialization, and smart specialization, you're surely all very well aware of, was introduced as probably the largest regional policy approach to address innovation-driven regional policy approach to create competitiveness and growth in all types of regions. That also was quite innovative in bringing this entrepreneurial discovery process into the approach as a new form of stakeholder consultation, which then was also taken up in the other two approaches. So I would, however, call this development of smart specialization, so smart specialization for sustained development goals, or S4, as well as the partnership for regional innovation as policy experiments. So because we don't know yet, of course, how they will work out, what the outcomes will be, and many policymakers themselves look for the best policy to address societal challenges. And to give you a little bit of background, I have here a little table that provides a very quick comparison. And that's not very much in depth, but I hope that it still shows the main differences between these approaches. And we mirror it, we compare it with smart specialization, so S3, because many of you know smart specialization, and then you will also know, maybe they get a hint of how we see kind of development in these policy experiments. So first of all, smart specialization, as I meant before, the main outcome was really competitiveness and growth. For sure, it was also transformation of regional economies. So if you read Ferre's work, it puts a lot of emphasis that smart specialization should also promote the transformation of the regional assets, the regional economy, into new domains of economic activities where regions might have a competitive advantage because of the strength they have developed in the past and ways how they can differentiate themselves from each other. But the main outcome was clearly that then all regions should find ways to compete in the global economy and grow. Of course, there was also quite some literature that was critical about it. There's a nice work of Robert Hassink and Hui-Wen Gong about that. For instance, recently in 2019, it was published in European Planning Studies. But in general, let's say this was this perspective. Then if you look at smart specialization for sustainable development goals, there is, it's of course already in the title, the desired outcome is not necessarily competitiveness and growth, but to contribute to sustainable development goals. And then if you look at the website of JRC and the countries and the regions that have experimented with this approach, you will see that there's always this anchor to one or the other, or usually several SDGs. So this kind of, could think about it as a menu of the SDGs, and you link your development to one or several of those. And theoretically, it of course is also informed by sustainability transitions and the idea that to actually achieve or contribute to the sustainable development goals, you have to think about system transformation, system change, so that the systems of production, consumption, diffusion, production and consumption, that they have to change fundamentally to actually achieve these SDGs. Then PRI, so Partnerships for Regional Innovations, they define the desired outcome more general, and they call it the guiding star, being long-term societal well-being. So they don't give kind of this list of SDGs, but they open up for regions to define themselves what they consider to be a priority to achieve long-term societal well-being. In that way, and as I will show later, it is less prescriptive, more open to an interpretation of what these goals might be at the end. Then another key difference relates to the policy framework. So S3 and S4, they're basically linked to structural funds. So when S3 was introduced, it was even ex ante conditionality to get the structural funds, ERDF funds for the regions. So there is, with this design of the smart specialization strategy, there are also funds that the regions then can use to promote the priorities defined in the smart specialization strategies. This is very different if you look at the PRI, because it's not linked to a particular program. The idea is basically that the coalition of actors that defines these priorities will then look out for the programs, various programs, that could potentially fund these priorities. So it's not necessarily only the structural funds or ERDF funds. It could also be some national funding or other European fundings. So basically, it's not linked to a funding stream at the moment, at least. So this, you define the priorities, but then maybe, as many regional policy actors do, they try to tap different pots to achieve their objectives, which on the one hand is maybe liberating. On the other hand, there might be less incentive to actually implement this kind of approach if it's not coming with a bag of money. Then if you look at the principal agent and the orchestrator, for S3 and S4, usually there is somebody in a regional development officer or somebody who has this kind of function that is tasked with orchestrating the process. That is the principal agent. Of course, different and other actors involved in the process, but the actor that gets the mandate to coordinate the process, to orchestrate the process, is usually a regional development officer. The PRI, in contrast, they put forward that this is really a whole of government approach, very much in line with the transformative innovation policy idea. And there, in principle, the orchestrator or the principal agent doesn't necessarily have to be a regional development officer. It could also be in other parts of a regional administration, for instance. So that is very different here, this policy framework and who is actually a principal agent. Then if you look at engagement and priority setting, then we see that in all these three approaches, the discovery process, so for smart specialization is the entrepreneurial discovery process, and for PRI, the open discovery process, they play an important role. And here, and we come back to that because when we discuss these experiments more in detail later, we have focused on the discovery process, which is the central process of engaging stakeholders for priority setting. And here the idea is, of course, that the policymaker, the politician, they are not necessarily the ones who have the best knowledge about the opportunities in which a region can develop or the most pressing problems to address to achieve societal well-being. In the smart specialization context, or especially the S3 context, the stakeholders involved were mainly the triple helix, so the government, the firms, and university sector, which are quite clearly defined, and then it's also quite, maybe not easy, but it's still quite straightforward which kind of actors involve. In S4, this opened up because it's not only growth that matters, but could also be some social goals. So it was mentioned that it's important to include civil society, which was largely excluded in S3. But there also the role of experimentation was put forward in stakeholder engagement and priority setting, because from theory or transition theory, where societal problems are often wicked problems, where you don't know really the problem is not really defined, the solutions are not really defined. You might need to experiment with different solutions, different actors to actually find a common ground on the formulation of the problem or also the solution. In PRI, this was opened maybe even further, but in a way it is a bit similar to S4 because they recognize that in smart specialization, the wider society was not involved in the process. And if you think about societal well-being, could be something like elderly care, could be something like schooling, healthcare. That is, of course, also very important, as we have also seen during the pandemics. And then you need to involve different stakeholders to maybe define the problem, but also opportunities for developing further. So in that sense, it went away from the entrepreneurial to an open discovery process where the priorities could be many and not related to, for instance, growth or the business sector. Another very important difference is in the implementation, because S3 was and S4 also, they're very prescriptive. So they have a guidebook, and there it's clearly laid out how to do the process and which steps, for instance, the regional development officer that kind of orchestrates the development of smart specialization strategies and implementation, what they have to do. PRI, as with the goal and the whole of government approach and so on, is much more open. They propose a playbook with multiple possible approaches and tools, how, for instance, priorities can be defined and how regions go about their regional policy agenda. So it is much more open. It offers different tools and methods to design and implement policies. And then if you look at the policy mix, in S3 it was mainly innovation economic policies. In S4, it's basically adding additional policy domains to innovation economic and economic policies. In PRI, it's also an opening up. So it's the mobilization of multiple relevant policy domains that don't necessarily need to be innovation economic if a social problem is to be addressed. So this is kind of a short overview of the policy experimentation that is ongoing. And of course, I cannot present any findings about any outcomes because there are no outcomes yet. But what we can do and what I try to do is to discuss theoretically what is actually needed for such policies to achieve the goal, so address societal challenges. So in a sense, the question that we asked, and here now I rely a lot on the presentation that we developed together with Lars Kuhn and Kevin Morgan, was how can most effective and powerful policy interventions be designed and implemented to address the societal challenges? And specifically, we want to ask under what conditions does the entrepreneurial and or open discovery process make such effective and powerful interventions possible? And we focus on the discovery process because this plays a very important role both in smart specialization, but also S4 and PRI. So we consider it quite important to discuss the concept of discovery because it has some implicit connotations which we consider are often not really discussed. And what I try to do is I try to walk you through a couple of these definitions to make this point. So if you look at the Oxford Learning Dictionary, also the Cambridge Dictionary, others, their discovery is usually defined as an act or the process of finding someone or something or learning about something that was not known about before. And if you look at the entrepreneurship literature, There, entrepreneurship is often also seen as the process of discovery, evaluation, and exploitation of opportunities. In the entrepreneurship literature, like Shane and Venkataraman, they quite explicitly say that entrepreneurship is a nexus of, on the one hand, opportunities, and the other hand, individuals that engage in this discovery process. And that while entrepreneurs might have different perceptions of these opportunities, the opportunities are something that exists independently of the actors, so that are kind of out there as something real. And there was also a recent paper which I find quite interesting that also puts forward or kind of summarizes this and argues that the dominant view is really that opportunities exist independent of individuals. So they are out there. They are arguing in that paper that this relates to a view of opportunities that was born in economic theory. Kirchner, for instance, when he writes about economic discovery process, suggests that it's kind of a process where ignorance is pushed out further, so that there are some opportunities out there, and through discovery and experimentation in a way of the entrepreneur, that actors learn about these opportunities kind of exist. But Bergman et al., they also argue that some see opportunities also differently. They see it that they argue that opportunities develop iteratively with individuals' engagement. So when entrepreneurs engage with opportunities, the opportunities change through the engagement, so that opportunities are not something that exists kind of independently of the actors. And this difference between the viewing opportunities as something external versus something that kind of develops through individual engagement is quite important, as we argue later. But at this stage, I think this distinction helps us to identify that the entrepreneurial discovery process, how it is viewed in smart specialization, and also how the discovery process is viewed in the PRI, also have the idea that opportunities are something that exists outside, independently of actors' engagement. So Fourier, for instance, argues that the entrepreneurial discovery precedes the innovation stage and consists of the exploration and opening up of a new domain of opportunities, technological and market, potentially rich in numerous innovations that will subsequently occur. And in this earlier work, he would then also say, first is this discovery, then there would be firms that maybe there would be new startups, new entries into this new domain, which starts with initial growth, and that policy should then support this growth, because in order to get this kind of critical mass, to have these external economies that you would find in, for instance, urban areas. So this is kind of the direction. First, discovery of an opportunity, and then somehow inform policy. And this kind of formulations you will also find in the playbook. So for instance, there it is suggested that the ODP is the central PRI mechanism for stakeholder engagement and co-creation. It is where new opportunities are co-discovered, where the agreement for the exploitation begins, and where joint plans for actions are developed. And if you go through the playbook, there are hints that that the opportunities are really seen as something external. For instance, by using the notions of windows of opportunity, or also on page 31, I think it is, they have a nice graph where they show this in a linear way. First, you discover opportunities, and then you inform the policy mix. So to be sure, of course, both in the playbook and S4, it's also mentioned that during the process, policymakers might learn what works and what doesn't, which then might inform again the discovery process, but I haven't seen any kind of formulation or a hint that actually policy could actually be used to shape the opportunity per se. Now, this then leads us to a couple of problems. The first one is the opportunity problem. If we see that as something external. Actually, if we talk about opportunity, we have used this concept of opportunity space to capture the possibilities for human intervention or agency in a given time or set of circumstances. So, because at any moment there are, of course, more than one opportunities, there are different opportunities, and you could kind of use the concept of opportunity space to capture these different possibilities. But then it's quite logical then if the perceived opportunity space, so if the perceived opportunity, the opportunities that actors perceive do not lie in areas that promote green or inclusive regional transformations, actors will not engage in this direction. And also if the real opportunity space, so the real opportunity space does not lie in areas that promote green or inclusive regional transformations, actors' engagement will not succeed. So, for instance, we did a case study in the maritime sector in Norway, and we went in 2014. It was just at the top when oil prices were still high, but started to fall. And they had 10 years of great business in supporting the oil platforms in the North Sea. And we talked also then about the green transformation, and they largely considered this as something, a distortion, or were very skeptical about that. Then we went there 2019, then of course the oil price collapsed, and there were a lot of course there was a lot of institutional change, there was change in the public debate and so on, and they had of course no business anymore in the oil sector, and so they saw the opportunity in green industries like serving offshore wind platforms, for instance, or doing ferries, that hybrid ferries or electrical ferries and stuff like this. But then we had discussion in 2021, and many of these opportunities didn't turn out well. So one large yard was taken over because they couldn't manage financially. So the real opportunity space didn't match what they perceived to be kind of opportunities. And when talking to them in 21, there were many were quite pessimistic and said, okay, but we will rely on oil the next 30 years. That will be our, where the main revenue will come in. And only there were a few, of course, that saw that differently, but there was kind of, this kind of fallback. So how actors actually perceive the opportunity space and how the opportunity space is actually constructed will both influence the actions of actors, but also whether these actions will succeed. And therefore, the discovery processes will not lead to effective and powerful interventions that address societal challenges if the perceived, the real opportunity space is not adequately structured for such goals. Then the other problem with that, with this kind of external, with this view on discovery processes, is the capacity problem. So, and this could be formulated as follows. So even if opportunities for green and inclusive development exist, it requires actors to perceive and make use of them. And if you think about, actors, then their ability to perceive and make use of opportunities depends on the actor region-specific properties that largely have developed in the past. So, for instance, it's the skills, it's the competence, it's the networks, it's the resources of actors, something that we called actor-specific opportunity space. And it also depends on regional preconditions and the embeddedness of regions in multi-scalar networks and institutional architectures. That is, we call this region-specific opportunity space. And I think that is also quite obvious. There are, of course, regions that have great preconditions to benefit from the green economy, that have a lot of clean tech companies, but then there are others that clearly can't, like old mining regions, coal mining regions, and so on. And in some regions, you don't have actors that have the skills, the competences, the networks or resources to make use of these new opportunities. In a sense, there is the possibility that it, of course, it's not the possibility, it will create new winners and new losers. So even if there are opportunities out there, if the actor and region-specific properties are inadequate for discovering, evaluating, and exploiting these opportunities, then the discovery process will also not yield effective and powerful interventions. And here we consider it quite problematic that in smart specialization, for instance, there's a lot of discussion about relatedness, and you have to develop competencies in related fields. But then if your competencies and related competencies would not help you to, or the development of related competencies don't help you to actually make use of these new opportunities, then this appears not to be very helpful. Then maybe you have to build other competencies, even though they are not related. And then we have another problem, which we call the actor composition problem. And this problem is basically one of, excuse me, it's basically one of who is heard in the discovery process. And there one can go back to a lot of policy interventions and how stakeholders are defined. And you can define them, of stakeholders, of course, as such who have power and influence, versus those that are affected by, for instance, societal challenges. And there, of course, become a big gap kind of opens up, because dominant actors, they are usually included, and they're often, but maybe not necessarily, have stakes in the old economy. But then if you think about the niche, the fringe, or vulnerable actor groups, they tend to be most affected, or they represent the most affected groups, groups that are most affected by environmental and societal threats. But they have a weaker voice in decision-making processes. And what becomes here quite obvious is that by including the societal challenges, the actor groups are open much more, because if regional policy is mainly about economic growth and economic policies, then it's maybe not so important to include, for instance, elderly people or sick people or marginalized groups, because they might, of course, should also be addressed by policy, but maybe there are other policies to address them. But if regional policy then is about addressing societal problems or contributing to sustainable development goals, then suddenly the vulnerable actor groups become much more important, and they need to be somehow integrated in the process. And of course, policymakers are aware that there are shortcomings in that regard. So for instance, in the playbook, they write clearly that stakeholders include the public, private research and public sectors. And ideally, non-governmental organizations and civil society should also be involved, yet this segment of society was in practice rarely included. So which kind of priorities are set and which kind of maybe problems or challenges are addressed depends on whom you ask and how to involve them. So, but then if you look at whether this policy approaches tackle really these problems, and there we can see that smart specialization, PRI, they address the capacity problem and the actor composition problem to some extent, but the opportunity problem is really not addressed. And what we then argue, therefore, is, or we ask, why do we limit agency to the discovery process? And of course, because this kind of neglects that the opportunity spaces are to a large extent also socially produced. So the knowledge production, institutions, but also the built infrastructure is socially produced. And it also neglects that the opportunity spaces are a necessary condition for creating the social engagement needed for transformation and for such engagement to be successful. And by ignoring that, there's a strong risk for capture by fit and conform niche innovations rather than what Smith and Raven called stretch and transform innovations. And it, maybe I skip these two things. Yeah, maybe now I talk briefly about that. And maybe it also ignores what we have learned about our agency perspective, because there, when we looked at regional development, we saw that, of course, innovative entrepreneurship plays a role, but also that the engagement of social actors in changing institutions or place-based leadership was quite influential in actually shaping the opportunity space. So it is possible to shape the opportunity space, the regional opportunity space, and it is maybe questionable why to ignore this in these new policy approaches. Or you could also look at that. So when we looked at different kind of case studies, we found that one kind of change process starts with the innovative entrepreneur and leads them, and then goes to place-based leadership and institutional change, which is largely the approach that is taken in S3, S4, and PRI. But what is ignored is a process where you maybe start with changing institutions, start with changing the opportunity space, and innovative entrepreneurship comes later. But which is a change process that is quite often, especially in those regions that are not known to be the most entrepreneurial regions. So what we argue then is that we need a more capacious agency perspective for sustainable regional development, which also focus on building legitimacy for interventions that tackle societal challenges. But we put into question that the new policy approaches, well, that might be the frame of exercising these types of agencies, but at the moment they are not. And what is also interesting is that if you look at these developments of different types of economies, the unregulated sectors of foundational economy, which is about the services that are needed, like healthcare, like education, and so on, for society to work. These opportunity spaces are typically region-specific. So local and regional actors have a lot of agency in creating and shaping such opportunity spaces. So this is maybe a short illustration what we would suggest. We think the discovery process is important, but that the discovery process needs to be operating in transformed opportunity spaces, because otherwise we will not achieve sustainable development. And to wrap up, we would argue that such a capacious agency perspective brings together top-down and bottom-up agency. So missions like promoted by Mazzucato, they are, of course, top-down with massive coordination and reflexivity problems, and here relate to feeding outcomes of bottom-up actions back to top in a timely manner, but also informing adaptive policymaking across sectors and levels. But it's, on the other hand, we have, of course, this critique of Mazzucato's work, which is basically hands-off entrepreneurial experimentation, bottom up with a neglect for the needed directionality to tackle existential societal challenges. And the more capacious agency perspective would suggest a bottom-up discovery process that unfolds in transformed opportunity spaces. And that part of these new regional development policies, they need to also focus on actually shaping opportunity spaces and not only on the discovery process. And that the transformation of opportunity spaces then can be seen as an emergent, multi-level, cross-sectoral agentic process, which are very much about institutional change, leadership, and legitimacy building. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Excellent. Very interesting perspective. So I'm sure there will be good discussion following this, but for now, I would only take one or maybe two questions of understanding, so quick questions if there are, and otherwise we would move forward towards the core thread and then go for the discussion of the different contributions. So are there any questions of understanding, quicker questions, as I said? Is there anything that you would like to have clarified? Then please raise your hand right now. Yeah, there's one question by Wolfgang Winder.
Yeah, Markus, thanks very much. I put it in the chat as well. It's about a definition because you use the term inclusivity, inclusive, quite often, which I find very interesting. But do you see any difference, definitional difference between inclusive development and co-development, or do you use both terms synonymously?
Yeah, I'm not so familiar with co-development. Inclusive development, from my perspective, is very much about the problem of disparities between regions, but also disparities between social groups, so that development should be the benefit not only of maybe the big metropolitan regions, but also maybe more peripheral regions, or not one group in society, but should also benefit maybe groups in society that cannot participate in the same extent from the knowledge economy. Co-development, I don't use that so much, so I would have to ask for your definition, but maybe it has to do more with developing something together. So, but I'm not using this definition so much, co-development, but I would, this inclusive development, I would, it's not, it is from this perspective that I mentioned before, and not from co-creating policy with different stakeholders, which of course could also be, you could also use that as inclusive, of course.
Thanks, Marcus. I don't see any further questions, so therefore I would suggest that we move forward, and I invite our second speaker now, Jonathan Morris from the IOER, with his co-presentation. John, you're a research associate here at IOER, now I think already in the second year. Your background is in geography and economics. You completed your master at Loughborough University in International Financial and Political Relations, and have also a PhD from the same university, where you moved on towards the Faculty of Civil and Building Engineering, but still dealing with questions of innovation and public policy design, in particular public procurement, which is one of your concerns, and sustainability criteria. So more broadly speaking, decision support for local policymakers and business managers. And you would talk about sustainability and well-being, what to measure and how to measure. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for the introduction, and thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So I will just share my slides. Can you see them?
Yes, works well.
So thank you. So yes, as from the introduction, my topic is on, my talk today is on sustainability and well-being, and looking at kind of what to measure, how we can measure things, and bringing in different perspectives from sort of more public policy discussions, but also from kind of business perspectives, and some of the work that I have done actually looking at kind of the business dimension. So a quick outline is to first of all look at why I'm interested in this topic. So really it's driven by this deficiency of a GDP focus, or gross domestic product, the kind of view that as long as the economy is growing, then we can come up with sustainable solutions to sustainability challenges and drive well-being, and you know, really improve kind of human satisfaction, quality of life. And then I'm also interested in the ways in which you might measure some of these kind of alternatives to a purely economic focus. So looking at composite indicators that have developed, but also looking at kind of a series of different measures that are often included together in terms of dashboard measures. And then looking at a kind of top-down perspective using national level data to see how this might play out in practice, and using an example of some research which has been applied to the business sector. And then following this up with a kind of reverse kind of bottom-up perspective, looking at environmental from supply chain management processes. And then I will finish off with a kind of summary of the ideas that we have for future research projects, particularly looking at catalogue of indicators and how we can kind of fit together measures which are being developed to allow comparisons between different countries, between different regions, between different industrial sectors, but also allowing some flexibility to kind of encompass the local perspective and the importance of dealing with kind of the characteristics that exist within local areas. So to start off with, I just want to kind of give a quick overview on kind of this reliance on economic measures for measuring well-being and sustainability. So I think this is maybe not new for people here, but generally we kind of look at gross domestic product as the measure of success in the economy. And we look at how much is being produced and what the value is being produced in an economy over a year and see whether or not that increases or decreases over time. This is a concept which is almost 100 years old, and the idea is that this growth in the economy would lead to improved well-being because people with good employment and with good incomes will be able to afford kind of goods and services that would improve their well-being and quality of life. However, even in the 1930s, like shortly after this became kind of policy objectives, there were warnings against the use of GDP for measuring welfare, and that by focusing on economy alone, you're missing out on aspects that kind of make life worth living, that make kind of life fulfilling. So there are problems because kind of looking at this economic perspective, we're also including kind of the cost that is required to fix problems that have been made from kind of our practices that produce economic growth. And that also we often rely on kind of average figures. So we might talk about GDP per capita, so kind of that average or the mean value in a country, and this fails to account for distributional impacts. So we don't see kind of where this wealth is being generated, who is generating it, and how that is contributing to society. And then we also miss the link between kind of economy, environment, and society. So we might generate wealth, but then what are we actually using it for? Are we using it to improve the environment? Are we using it to improve societal well-being? Or is this kind of, are we cutting back on environmental standards, on societal standards in order to generate increased growth? So that brings on to then the question of what to measure. So there's a lack of global consensus regarding what sustainability actually is, and from different academic perspectives, there are different ideas of what should be prioritized in sustainability. And often we sometimes see that sustainability and well-being are grouped together because we might consider well-being as part of a kind of a broader social sustainability. But there is also some arguments that well-being should be a distinct topic. So what is needed is some kind of framework that can help us to assess how kind of our economic practices are actually impacting on our sustainability performance and on well-being performance, but also a narrative which can really be sold to the public as this is something that should be prioritized. So we see, especially at the current climate, that many people are concerned about kind of what is happening with GDP figures, and especially following the coronavirus pandemic. But it's much harder to communicate kind of what the impacts are on kind of sustainability, well-being, and until maybe sometimes that you have challenges where it's actually a bit too late to start reacting. So the importance of developing new measures is that we can kind of align these with existing targets that are already in place. So for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, which we mentioned earlier, and also for different kind of policy principles. So for example, at European Union level, the European Pillar of Social Rights. And so there's no need to kind of invent completely new terms and concepts, but to try and find kind of measures and the ways in which they're communicated that can fit kind of existing, well-known, well-understood kind of targets, goals, and principles. It's also important to understand the trade-offs. So if focusing on certain aspects of sustainability or well-being may have knock-on effects that are, or unintended consequences on different measures that maybe aren't the core focus. And so it's important that there is an understanding that trade-offs occur and that sometimes these are necessary. And so it's the way in which the data is presented also needs to account for the trade-offs that exist. And this can be between different concepts and different components of sustainability, but it can also occur within different regions and different localities. So when looking at say the distributional aspects of economic growth, targeted interventions to try and deal with these distributional issues may have some unintended consequences elsewhere. What then is proposed is that dashboards of indicators can be provided that can cover a range of different measures, that can show clearly where some trade-offs occur, can show kind of general progress overall, but it also makes it harder for policymakers to track the overall progress and to communicate with the public this clear narrative story. And we see that sometimes where there are maybe some negative impacts on certain areas which have occurred because there's been a focus on generating benefits in other areas, it's sometimes the negative story that is being told. And so this also leads back to this idea of having clear and adequate communication. I want to go through some examples of kind of measures of sustainability and well-being that already exist to kind of set up what will come later in the presentation. So the first one is the Human Development Index, which is certainly from my studies is the most common measure that I have found. And this really brings together three different dimensions. So there is a dimension which focuses on long and healthy life. And this is measured essentially on life expectancy at birth. And then there is one on knowledge, so access to education and for how long you are likely to be able to access that education. And then a decent standard of living. And by combining these different measures, you get a Human Development Index figure, which ranges between 0 and 1. And so the idea here is that it's not just about generating economic growth and about generating wealth, but that this is also accompanied by improved healthcare, improved education. And so we see from the Human Development Index from 2017 that you can produce maps such as the one on the screen here. And this can give an indication on additional measures at national level about how well countries are performing in certain areas. However, this is the Human Development Index is quite narrow. It focuses only on 3 different dimensions, one of which is GNI per capita, so it's still focused very much on economic measures. And so we see that other organizations have also tried to develop their own databases and their own data sets, which try to incorporate different sustainability and well-being measures. So one example that I'll show here is the OECD, which has a How's Life database, which covers figures at national level for OECD countries and a few other affiliated countries, but it also has a regional well-being data set for major sub-regions within these countries. And the topics include things such as income, employment, but also kind of different measures around employment. So how satisfied are people in their jobs, the salaries, how safe they feel in their employment, and also things such as like the living requirements that they have. So number of people per room. So how well is kind of like the shelter that they have that is provided. We have measures such as life expectancy at birth, mortality rate, and also measures that cover things such as air pollution, environmental quality. So we can see that these are broadly grouped around kind of 11 different key dimensions, and you can see them listed in the diagram below. And they are measured using kind of averages, but also looking at ranges and looking at inequalities between different groups and breaking down the data sets according to kind of gender and other kind of socio-demographic characteristics. The problems with this is that we're still kind of relying on kind of collected data from government agencies. So there's a big problem with data availability and also data comparability. And when we look at the regional wellbeing data sets, these sub-regions are ones which are defined by the countries themselves. So they define how the country is split up below the national level. So this can also make some comparisons difficult. Nevertheless, we can use these to assess how well countries are performing. So for example, I picked the latest data that's available for Germany. So we can see that then they kind of classify different measures according to how each country performs relative to the other OECD countries. And there's also some headline statistics that can be provided. So for example, in Germany in 2018, according to these measures, 10% of the population of the country lived in relative income poverty, and 9% of the population report low life satisfaction, and 21% are not satisfied with how they spend their time. So you can see how these measures kind of go beyond just the kind of overall economic focus of the country, and these can be compared over time to see whether or not there is improvements. We can also see how Germany compares to other countries. So For example, in greenhouse gas emissions per capita, it's actually in kind of the lower tier of OECD countries, but is very high in trust in governance, is very high in kind of species protection and in kind of asset generation. There's also issues about whether or not these data actually cover what is really important to the population. So trying to put objective measures on well-being by looking at kind of these databases that look at employment rates and look at kind of how much kind of free time that people have, it doesn't always tap into kind of how people actually feel. So there have been drives, for example, in the United Kingdom to have self-reported well-being and to send out kind of nationwide questionnaires to see whether or not people are happy, they're satisfied with their life, things such as how anxious they are about the current situation, about the future. And these are things which were designed in order to kind of supplement government policy making. So we can see that then subjective measures can also be used alongside kind of objective measures on how the economy or how the environment is performing. For the United Kingdom, if looking at kind of the well-being measures, there are a number of different indicators, and these are broken down at local authority level, of which there are around 500 different local authorities across the country. And these can range from the size of a city of around sort of 250 to 300,000 people to kind of large kind of rural areas, which would have maybe 80,000 people in them. And so we can see that there are a number of different measures that are covered here, and they cover a mix of objective measures. So, for example, employment rate of people in kind of the economically active age range, the disposable income per head of population, but also things like happiness, anxiety, feeling life is worthwhile. And so we map out here these kind of indicators at an average level of each local authority in the country, and then you can see the distribution, whether or not they are above the median or below the median. This gives a massive database. There are many different indicators that exist, and some of them kind of are correlated strongly with each other. They overlap with each other. So one thing which was done by the Office of National Statistics in the UK was to actually try to reduce the amount of data that is provided. So they ran principal components analysis, which essentially tries to explore where there are different indicators that have similarities in the kind of structure and characteristics with each other, and to bring up a smaller group of indicators that could be used to cover a broad range of data. So according to this analysis, they came up with 4 kind of broad-based topics, which are neighborhood relationships, political engagement, organized social and civic engagement, and friendship and safety. And the kind of drive for this is to consider how these indicators could be used for guiding kind of policy analysis, but also how you can try to kind of dig deeper into a more kind of closer to the individual level. And so a quote from the document which carries out this analysis talks about actually exploring using kind of social media as a way of trying to explore even further below the local authority level about kind of well-being within the population. And so this was something which was kind of carried out in a town called Rochdale, which is near in kind of the Greater Manchester area. It is a kind of post-industrial town, and they had a pilot scheme to assess happiness through the use of Twitter. So essentially the council were trying to kind of scan the tweets where Rochdale is mentioned to try and get an overview of what people thought of the town. And there were many questions which came up from this. First of all is how useful is this data, and is it kind of biased by the fact that Twitter is often a platform where people complain a lot about things, but there's maybe not so much praise. And also there are issues about how can you use this data and how can you kind of how can you bring it together to overcome kind of this this problem with complexity and the kind of simplicity of using kind of a single measure which indicates how successful the economy is functioning. The council want to use this kind of indicator that they get from social media to carry out when it should hold events and how it organizes its services and how the public responds to regeneration efforts. And in theory, it could be quite a cost-effective way to get some responses to some of these actions. But of course, there is also this risk that you have to look at the profile of who is actually using Twitter and who is actually tweeting about Rochdale and what that might indicate in terms of feedback that the council use. So overall, from this part, it's kind of brings in this complexity and the applications of data that could be obtained from here. So from the OECD's How's Life data set, for example, there's already 53 different indicators, which for kind of policymakers and for the designing of policy and for the assessment of success becomes very challenging, because it's very hard to then assess 53 different indicators and then communicate that to the public about how the situation is. We also find that different countries have kind of their own indicator sets, which are completely independent from each other. And so they're not always comparable internationally. And we have problems with generating time series data because the methodology changes over time. And also between countries, they're just not comparable at all. We also have issues with self-reported well-being. So how reliable and how time-specific are the responses? So when are questionnaires sent out, who is being asked? How is the sample determined? Is it possible then to kind of use this over time and see whether or not progress has been made? And this also raises issues regarding response biases. So who is more likely to respond to a government-sponsored questionnaire about how you're feeling about the world? And also about who is using social media to talk about kind of well-being. So there remain lots of issues about how you can track progress over time, and also across space, and also across different spatial scales from national level down to kind of community level. Yes, so I'll just talk quickly about two studies that have been done in the past. So the first one was to look at business level and to use the Human Development Index to look at how kind of businesses' material productivity, so the resources that they use, and how this kind of generates environmental, social, and economic development. So it follows the lines of the Human Development Index, but it uses data from the OECD Green Growth Series. And then we try to develop this kind of integrated resource efficiency to look at sustainability performance at the business level and integrate social, economic, and environmental sustainability into a single measure. So this then came up with kind of 3 subcomponents, which were based on the methodology of the Human Development Index. So we had a social efficiency, an environmental efficiency, and economic efficiency. And this was then aggregated up to national level where the data was available. And what this then allowed was to provide kind of businesses the opportunity to look at different countries where they are purchasing resources from, and they can start to see how their kind of business decisions are related to the kind of social and environmental performances of countries. And so we see that because this is OECD level, there's a relatively high level of social resource efficiency, which is the graph on the left. And then we see the most of the variation is in terms of the environmental performance. And so this is how we try to then link this to kind of business practices. So it's not just kind of national policymakers, but also business policymakers. The problem we have here is that it's still data that's expressed at national level, and we still have the same issues with before that, that we have kind of gaps in the data, that we have problems with comparing across different years. And also it's very hard to find kind of a year where it is possible to get enough data to actually do the analysis on this. And the final part, because running a little bit over time, is to look at kind of a more bottom-up approach that can be used. And so again, looking at the business perspective, we look at supply chain environmental processes. And so there's a database called EcoInvent, and this has a catalog of a lot of different supply chain environmental impacts. And what we did in our study is that we first of all did a preliminary filtering, and we had 215 different environmental impact indicators that could be analyzed, again, using principal components analysis. And by running this analysis on a sample of 1,000 different, on 1,000 different processes, we came up with 5 different factors. And what we really found here is that a number of environmental impacts at a business level are co-correlated with global warming potential. And so our conclusions here was that probably at a business level, at a general level anyway, you could focus on reducing CO2 emissions, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and probably you would also achieve reductions in other environmental sustainability indicators. And what I will leave with this last part is that the importance here is to look at who the data is actually for. So when we actually split these processes according to different industries, so glass manufacturing, steel production, transport and logistics, and cement reduction, we found that actually we had global warming potential, greenhouse gas emissions as one indicator, and then we started seeing specific indicators related to that industry itself. So our conclusion was that the decision makers require kind of a flexible catalogue of indicators, that we might need to have indicators that we can compare across different spatial scales, across different regions, but that also we should have this flexibility to be really adapted to the kind of specific context that we're facing. And therefore, the conclusions are that there should be this kind of commonality, but also this flexibility, which allows us to merge local needs with also global responses, and that we can then kind of develop these indicator methodologies that can really help us with public policy development, but also the means of communicating this to the public. So thank you very much for your attention, and interested in any questions or comments that you may have.